Hey, it's Amethyst Virgo. I wanted to talk about Mars and Gemini in retrograde. Initially, I had no plans to make a video about this, but once the retrograde officially hit last week or so, I noticed that I've been feeling it. Some other people have been feeling it. Thematically, you can see Mars in Gemini, that retrograde really, kicking a lot of things up, a lot of conflict, a lot of verbal issues, a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misconstrued actions, because we do have to talk about how a Mars retrograde is not exactly the same as a Mercury retrograde. So I do want to dive into all of those things. There are timestamps, so pick what is of interest to you. If you want to just know about the general energy, there's a timestamp for that. I will then be talking about some news stories that relate to this energy, such as the unfortunate passing of Migos rapper Takeoff. I'm going to talk about Elon Musk buying Twitter, a few other news stories, and I also will be discussing Mars in Gemini retrograde through the houses. So we're going to look at your rising sign, and you can see some potential themes that could come up. So feel free, click on the timestamps, find what's of interest to you. So first of all, I want to really firstly share how when we're talking about a transit, that is an energy that everyone can potentially feel, okay? Whether it directly affects your chart in the way that it might someone else's who actually is a Gemini or has placements in Gemini or very strong energy that's Mercurian or not, we're all going to see, observe, or feel the transit, all right, in some way. Now, the Mars in Gemini, let's not mistake the fact that there are people who have Mars in Gemini. So to distinguish the two, a Mars in Gemini individual would typically be someone who acts on ideas. Remember, Mars is action, Mercury is thought. And so Mars has to learn how to be a little bit more thought-driven than it can be in Aries. But Mars in Gemini individual can sometimes, one thing I think that's really great about this placement is that the person tends to act in ways where they're not locked into one way of doing things. They are flexible. They are willing to try things in a new way. There's an openness about the way in which they execute certain things. You can sometimes get a person to see the value in proceeding with a different course of action, right? Or something interests them mentally, they're going to try it. They want to, allow themselves to become indulged in it. So that could be the benefit. Sometimes they can be easily distracted, especially if there's something in particular they're supposed to have their focus on, but they can be quick to act. Like in the moment, if something has to get done, someone has to fulfill a role, someone has to fulfill a need, Mars and Gemini can be really quick with that. It's not a fixed sign. It is not an earth sign. It is not locked into one mode, or it's not so focused on, things that have a clear outcome, right? Because we know Gemini can generate those ideas. Now they can be very, again, like I said before, they can adapt very well to certain circumstances and experiences and be quick to act. And sometimes you can look at, especially with athletes, look at what's going on with their Mars sign. Especially Gemini, remember, besides the lungs, Gemini also rules, the hands, fingers. So a person who has good hand-eye coordination, there tends to be some type of Gemini energy behind that. So let's talk about the fact that Mars has been in Gemini for about 2.5 months or so. Mars went in Gemini in August, I believe. So what we want to also focus on is the fact that when we're thinking of the retrograde, what it is doing is it is creating an energy where the planet is not performing in the way in which it directly does. There's a lot of redos. There's a lot of go back and revisit something. It is about having to pause, or it is about not fully being able to go full throttle. And that is very difficult for Mars, because we know Mars is about action. So this can be a period of feeling like things are now at a standstill or inactive. If you were feeling Mars in Gemini in a positive way, in August, in September, etc., and then all of a sudden there's a difference or something comes to a halt, or all of a sudden there's some misinformation or something you don't know in order to move forward, that is what we're dealing with Mars, okay? So this is less about the Mercurian type of retrograde. With Mars, we're going to talk about actions, we're going to talk about conflict, we're going to talk about all the different themes we can find with Mars. Now, if you have Gemini in your chart, especially in the degrees of the transit, of the retrograde transit especially, you may feel it more directly. Okay, you can look this up, go to your chart, plug in the degrees, you know, and see what is going on with their energy. Even if you don't have Gemini energy in the chart, if you have air energy in the chart, and are there any significant placements that are aspecting Mars and Gemini transit in your chart, it is important for you to look through that. Or see what potentially can be coming down the pike for you. Even for some people, maybe you don't have Gemini, but you have Sag in the chart, right? And really understanding that eventually, especially if you have Sagittarius within those degrees that the Gemini transit goes in, you're going to have an opposition at some point. Okay, that Mars and Gemini retrograde is going to be out opposing your Sag energy in your chart and producing some things to work through, some challenges. And I'll talk in the end some ideas for how to work through a retrograde. Mars is currently at 25 degrees, okay? As you know, with degrees in transit, it's going to ebb and flow, go through different degrees throughout the course of its transit. One thing I think that's very, very important to note is that Mars is squaring Neptune. So right now, we know Neptune has been in Pisces for several years. It's within 3 degrees. So also that kind of ambiguity about the things that have to get done, questions of what is to happen next, right? With Mars likes to go full throttle, but when Mars is squaring Neptune, there can be there's something that's not clear. There's a level of uncertainty, right? Because we're dealing with Mars, which wants to produce some level of activity, with Neptune, which is about dreams and idealism. Okay, so there can be some themes there. Mars, remember, is the planet of war, dominance, power, aggression, execution. How are we executing this? How are we getting this done? Okay. Now we know that sometimes we think of these words, it can be seem a bit much for people, but at the end of the day, Mars is about dominance. It is about action. It is about activity. Okay. And of course, when Mars is in a planet, in a sign where it can fully be itself, that could produce a different type of experience. However, already Mars has to be in Gemini, right? And I talked about that earlier. So it's in a sign that's more cerebral. So this is definitely going to impact people's words, people's communication. People might act out based on communication, okay? This can mean people are more directly acting on quick thoughts. Okay, so Mars and Gemini can sometimes be that more adaptive. I'm going to do this. Yes, I have this idea. Let's go. Mars and Gemini in retrograde can be, a person maybe acting out in a way that doesn't produce the same level of results that we typically want Mars to do, right? Someone can do something that we are surprised by. Okay, someone can reverse something that was going well, right? People may feel stuck as well, or like ideas or actions ideas that they have aren't moving forward. Again, like I said, if Mars and Gemini, if that's in your chart and you were going, now all of a sudden something comes and now you feel like there's some level of, something is not flowing the way that you would like it to flow. People are acting off information or comments that bring discord. So it's not a very harmonious energy going on, at this time. Now, fiery confrontations can happen. People may have to take back what they said later. Just be careful. Also, keeping in mind, thematically, Gemini, besides communication, rules vehicles, car accidents, car recalls. Think about those different things. I don't have any moving violations in my driving. Okay. Pride myself on that. But last week, someone hit the back of my car. Now, luckily it wasn't totaled or anything, but there's damage. So, and I could only think to myself, I'm like, this is so strange. This typically does not happen to me. I've never had an accident that was moving. And so I was okay and everything like that, but that's just something that stands out. Also, Gemini rules the lungs. So let's quickly look at some vehicle stories. So I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but these are just examples. The reason I brought this up, especially with the Santa Fe Sport Hyundai, recalling that car, is for potential engine fires. So remember, Mars, fire. Okay. Not only that, we have other two news stories that have to do with vehicles. Britt Reed, friend of you who know who he is, the ex-Chiefs coach, was sentenced to 3 years in prison over a car crash. So again, Mars, think about Mars as like coming back to make you do something. So Mercury is, you're rethinking something, you are relearning something. Mars is coming back to make you do something, or it's causing some type of action, okay? And there was another unfortunate story. The KU basketball player, Jethro, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, Muscadin, maybe? Muscadin, I'm not sure. He died 10 months after a crash. So this was last year. He got into a car accident. He was basically, I believe in a coma for, the duration of that year, and he passed away. So think of those things. And I'm not saying that Mars and Gemini caused this. I'm saying that it's almost like a certain transit comes around to kind of create that energy, right? So it's not that this is because Mars and Gemini exist. It's if something is likely to happen, it's going to likely happen during that time, if that makes sense. I also saw these news stories, which I thought were interesting because we want to, if you start to hear a lot of talk about lungs, vaping. I just got an email from, it was interesting. I got an email from my health insurance, because sometimes they'll email you like stories or like tips. The email was about vaping, and you've probably seen all those commercials about it. So if you hear, now that's not relevant to this, because here we're talking about a child that needed a lung transplant. There was a transplant also from a retired auto worker. That news story. There was a news story also about a variant of COVID that apparently attacks the lungs. So these are stories that deal with, something that's relevant to current events or people and their individual stories. But also the thing I wanted to say is that, but don't be surprised if you hear other stories that somehow have to do with breathing, the lungs, because that is what Gemini rules, okay? And Mars can be about something that is attacking, especially if we hear anything else about this Delta Cron variant. Now, Elon Musk buys Twitter. So this was not, now I want to get the dates right, okay? First, April 14th of this year is when the announcement was made that he was interested in buying Twitter, okay? But the purchase didn't actually happen until October 27, 2022, which was last week or so. And so what's interesting about it is when I looked at April 14th, 2022, that was during Aries season. Elon Musk is a Cancer, so the sun was squaring his sun at that time. Also, Venus was in Pisces at that time. He has Venus in Gemini. So Venus was squaring Pisces at that time, which might have indicated it wasn't the best time for him to officially buy Twitter, officially become, financially invested in Twitter. Now, here's what I'm going to say. When I do astrology for these types of stories, I'm not going to talk about whether it's a good idea for him to do it or not. Let's just talk about the astrology of it. One, he has Mars in Gemini. Well, Mars is in Gemini at the 25th degree, right? He doesn't have Mars in Gemini, but he has Venus in Gemini, okay? And so that is creating this within 6 degrees of conjunct, okay? Venus can represent your money, okay, which you have a value. So Mars, just in time, so he made the purchase 2 days before Mars went into retrograde, okay? Now, and you would say that's probably a better move, okay? Now, I do think this whole thing is going to be influenced by Mars and Gemini's retrograde. So even if the deal went through well, there's still this energy going on. Now, Elon Musk has Mars in Aquarius at the 20th degree. Why is that important? Well, that means that Mars in Gemini retrograde right now is trining his Mars in Aquarius at the 20th degree, right? There's a trine within 5 degrees. Now, here's the thing with that. Mars in Aquarius, that means he is going to make some big moves with this. And Mars in Aquarius energy doesn't ask for permission. He is not coming in there. Look at the stories. I'm not making this up. He's not coming in there to say, hey, let's have a meeting. Let's talk about how we want to do this. He already has a vision for how he wants this done. Okay. And what's important about that is that he already is saying he wants to make membership fees for the blue checks, the verified accounts. He already kicked Kathy Griffin off Twitter for impersonating him. So Mars in Aquarius, that energy is not about following anyone else's rules. You kind of don't know what you're going to get with Mars in Aquarius. It can be quite unpredictable in their movements. Aquarius energy tends to believe it's doing something for a vision or a reason, right? Like they can rationalize and explain why they're approaching something that way, but it may not always be clear for other people to know. So since Mars in Gemini is in retrograde, and that's making that Mars in Aquarius, he's going to probably do a lot of different experimental types of things with Twitter about in this time. Now, the astrology of Twitter actually was thought of before this, but this is the launch date. The official launch date for Twitter was July 15th, 2006. So Twitter is a Cancer sun, and so is Elon. Twitter also is a Mercury in Cancer, okay? Twitter is also, if you look at, everything that is created has a birth chart, okay? A company, an organization, cities, everything has a birth chart. And so Twitter has Venus in Gemini at the 25th degree, which means it is making that conjunct with the Mars in Gemini transit. See how all that energy comes together. So it's not about whether you agree with Elon Musk buying it, you like Elon Musk, you do or you don't, or whatever the critiques are. The astrology supports why this happened at this time and not when he originally brought it up. Mars is in Leo at the 25th degree. Why is that important? Because Mars in Gemini is at the 25th degree. So when you see something directly aligned, now Mars in Leo would be making that sextile to Mars in Gemini. Okay? So it's putting a spotlight on Twitter. Not only is, because even people who don't even pay attention to Twitter or don't have one are probably now thinking and talking about this because Elon Musk has taken over, and that means there are going to be some changes. So let's talk about you, right? So depending on where you are in this video, maybe you've gone directly to this because you're like, look, I just want to know about me. So this is what we're going to do. So we're going to go based on your rising sign. So here's the thing though. Now let's say you're a person that uses Placidus. I default to Placidus, most of the time. So if I'm using Placidus, maybe I am a Taurus rising, a late degree Taurus rising, but Mars is in Gemini in my first house, right? It's transiting that house. You can definitely still use this, right? Whole signs is going to make it just a little bit cleaner, but if you're a person who's like, I use Placidus, so actually I'm not a Gemini rising, but Mars is in my first house, then, just listen to this and see what resonates, okay? So if Mars is transiting your first house, especially if you're a Gemini rising, it can represent or mean that you could be confrontational with words, especially if you have to stand up for yourself, especially if you are someone who usually doesn't. You might be tired of something. You may have noticed certain patterns, right? So, Mars in retrograde can also mean like there's something you're not taking anymore. You're now going back to resolve something. And maybe, you have had repeated situations or issues, and now you're at a place where you have to have a little bit of, self-awareness enough to stand up for yourself. But this can mean that this caused a little bit of a rift in certain situations. I've seen this. There's a Gemini that I know who's having to deal with these situations. So if you are a Gemini, you're really feeling this. I wouldn't be surprised. Now, if you're a Cancer rising or you have this transiting your 12th house, Mars in Gemini retrograde, this can represent resolving emotional conflicts. They may require you to confront your hidden feelings though, right? And a lot of times people, especially if you have Cancer in the 12th house, you're learning how to, prioritize those feelings that sometimes are not out in the open. You're learning what you actually care about, what is actually something that you want to preserve. Sometimes it does mean that, I have this video where I talk about Cancer through the houses, that Cancer in the 12th house sometimes can be, you're unaware of how much you're affected by certain things, right? But you may feel attacked emotionally, and it's going to make your feelings more potent, okay? Remember, Mars can attack. And if we're talking about Gemini, it can mean that you're now having new feelings, but you're also having new thoughts and new insights, and you might be looking at something in a different way. Now, if it's a Leo rising or 11th house, this can be conflicts may arise even with people you usually get along with, 11th house, associations, groups, etc. If it's something that hasn't been resolved, right? Those things, like I do think sometimes retrogrades help us notice the when you try to smooth something over, but it's a bump, right? If I'm trying to iron something, but there's that wrinkle there, right? Or I'm trying to smooth wallpaper, but there's that bubble there. That sometimes is like the retrograde helps us go back and be like, whoa, this is not what we think it is. We need to go back and fix this in order to move on. And the reason I bring this up is because the 11th house can mean there's something amongst a group or an organization or something that you are a part of that has not been resolved. And it can bring conflict. People have disagreements. People have different opinions. You may be disagreeing with people you typically don't, right? Group conflicts that have to do with unsettled information. An example I put was like friends group. You're going on a trip, but now you're arguing over the money. Or so-and-so said we were supposed to pay this much, but so-and-so is now saying this much, it's this much money. Or so-and-so owes me money from this trip. If your friend group is kind of in a little bit of a disarray, it can mean that Mars and Gemini is transiting that 11th house, okay? Now, if you're a Virgo rising, or Mars and Gemini is in your 10th house, this can mean conflicts with agreements that were made, okay? There can be difficulty with things that you had thought you were on the way to doing or being, and now there is something you have to kind of fight against, or something that you have to kind of power through. Is it always bad? Not all the time. Think of it as just like, a pinata, right? A pinata. I have to keep hitting this pinata until I get the candy. That's kind of what this experience is for this placement. It also can mean authority figures in your profession. It can mean there's a disagreement, there's discord, there's something, and it has to do with communication and verbalizing things. So don't be surprised if there's something you have to communicate in a more direct way than usual, You also could be returning back to career journeys or unfinished business that relates to a goal. So if you're like not dealing with the conflict that I'm talking about with authority figures, it can mean like you're going back to deal with something, and it might have been something you left on the side of the road, but you're going back to it because there could be things that you have to refocus on. Maybe there's information you weren't privy to before, and now Mars is really allowing you to kind of revisit, revamp, and do something to actually put that in motion. Libra rising 9th house could mean confronting what you believe and rethinking some of your views. You might have to grapple with some uncomfortable information, but also, your trips, you might be going on trips or excursions that are unplanned. Mars and Gemini, 9th house, that energy is not, it's not consistently aware of its destination, right? But it knows it wants to, experience something. It knows it's very curious about certain things. And so it's hard to stay put. So for you, it may be a little bit more about the experiences that you're allowing yourself to have. Okay. But it requires you to rethink and possibly do things in a slightly different way. Now, Scorpio rising or 8th house, Mars and Gemini. Arguments over things you were promised or expected to receive, especially if it's any type of, relationship or partnership or union, something that there's something not going your way. And it can be something you have to negotiate. It can be something that you have to bring up with someone that can be uncomfortable. Like, hey, you owe me this money, but you didn't pay me back yet, right? Investigations, that can definitely be a case here. In an investigation, of course, for some people, yeah, you could say like something serious, but investigation could simply be like, I need to look more into something. I thought I knew it, but I'm not quite sure. I need to, it could be a person trying to figure something out about someone, right? It's like the scorned spouse hiring a private investigator, right, to follow their spouse or something like that, right? Like that's, I'm not saying you would do that. That's the energy of that, okay? Now, Also can mean lawsuits, dealing with a lawsuit. Maybe it's not against you, but maybe it's like you're trying to get your money back, or you're trying to in some way communicate something to someone that requires them to give you what you're supposed to get, or what what you agreed on, or having to pay back money. Having to pay back, having to communicate, having to in some way deal with something that can be quite difficult, but it's something that's not resolved. But it requires a lot of communication. Misinformation could also be a case here. Like, why do I have to pay this fee for this? I thought I already paid this, right? It's that type of energy. Now, Sagittarius rising the 7th house. Now, for these people would be old arguments and unresolved relationship issues resurface, okay? There's already something brewing. And again, as a Sagittarius rising, that's your sense of truth can be so strong. Like whatever your focus and your the way life is kind of unfolding for you requires you to constantly be facing the truth. And you're on this journey, but then we have to understand we are on a personal journey, but we have to deal with someone else. We are involved. We are now having to consider all their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences, and it's not just about you. So it can mean, if that's how you're thinking about these things, you're not going to reach a conclusion easily. It's like going around a merry-go-round with arguing or something that is just difficult. It's a lot to be said. But remember, this is the contrast. The 7th house is the house of Venus. Mars, if you were to say what planet is the direct opposite of Venus, would be Mars. Mars is willing to battle. Venus wants peace. The Capricorn rising, your 6th house, Mars and Gemini transit, changing and adapting ordinary routines, which we know is not always something Capricorn energy wants to do. Now, of course, if you have other placements in the chart, this may not be super aligned, but what you plan needs to be adjusted, and you need to move a little quicker. And I know sometimes it's a struggle for you, right? That might be a struggle to have to do that, but it's going to be essential to you to understand how to learn how to adjust your goals. It might mean that somebody puts pressure on you. This needs to be done by tomorrow. Hey, we actually have a tighter deadline, right? That is something. But I do think sometimes challenges give us new skills that we wouldn't have gotten had we not undergone that challenge. Aquarius rising, your 5th house. This could definitely be something related to your competitiveness. Something becomes challenging that you're usually good at, or you seek to challenge yourself. You might, I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to try this new thing. It's going to probably be very challenging mentally as well. Or it can mean something that you have to rethink your abilities. You have to rethink something that is now a little bit more difficult. Even if you want to use the 5th house meaning, there's many meanings to the 5th house, just like all houses. I have the video about the 5th house if you want to check that out, where I talk more in depth about that. But the 5th house can be dating. You could have a person, right? Maybe it's getting too hard to remember all the people you're dating, or you're juggling a lot of different things, and it's not fun anymore. 5th house is fun, but when you hit these retrogrades, when these retrogrades hit your 5th house, sometimes it can mean like things that used to be fun can now become daunting, especially Mars and Gemini, and so your focus is a little bit off. So that's what we're going to think of. The 5th house is causing a little bit of competitiveness with something. I think of this for those of you who are into tarot. This energy, especially this house, would be like 5 of Wands. It's 5 of Wands energy. It's competition, okay? Pisces rising or 4th house, Mars and Gemini transit. You can't ignore something anymore that deals with family, home, or the past. Mars and Gemini, something's going to come up, and it can cause conflict. Sometimes we can talk about things and it's simply a release, right? But when we have Mars and we're dealing with Mars and we're dealing with Gemini energy, it's different, because what's happening here is that it's basically coming out, right? Mars and Gemini, though I talked earlier about it's not a direct line, right? It's not direct. It's not a direct streamline, right? It can adapt, right? But it's not a quiet energy. You see it, you hear it. Mars and Gemini is not going to be a quiet energy, okay? And because of that, that means that the Pisces rising, even if you're a Pisces rising, you have a lot of Pisces energy, you have a lot of down-to-earth energy in your chart, it still means Mars and Gemini is hitting that area where there's a lot of sensitivity. And so you may have difficult conversations with loved ones, or need to, or it can create some level of conflict or discord, but you have to ask yourself, are these the conversations, or is this the action that needs to happen? It could be something very difficult. It can be, hey, I know we talked about this a lot of times, but we really need to sell, let's say you have a family of siblings or something, and they have to sell the family home. The parents passed away or something, and they're like, we can't take over this home. That would be a very difficult conversation, but it's one that would need to happen at some point, right? And with the retrograde, it can mean, how sometimes we forget certain things and we kind of just play them off, and then eventually we get to a place where we can't do it anymore. So that's an example of what that could mean. Now, if you are an Aries rising already, Mars is the chart ruler, right? Anytime the chart ruler is somewhere, we got to pay attention to that, because that is the ruler of your chart. And so it might be a little bit more potent for you. So even if you're someone like, wait a minute, that Mars in Gemini transit is not going to hit my degrees. But if you're using whole signs, that Mars in Gemini is in your third house. And so it still is going to have some type of impact. And so an example could be definitely like arguments among siblings, disagreements over things shared. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. It could just mean that you're just not in a good place. Someone is speaking up. Someone has to be the person that is taking the lead in certain things. But be careful not to say things you don't mean, okay? But there might be certain things you have to rehash. There could be things that are now coming back. There could be things that you resolved with someone, and now you're like, why is this coming back? Why do I have to talk about this again? You may also be trying to prove or act on something you've said. You feel the need to back up your words, but sometimes that could be something else. That could be ego speaking. So just being careful of like that energy and what that is potentially meaning for you. Now, Taurus rising or second house, things that may have felt settled are not done. And we look at the second house as money, as finances. The second house relates to your values about money, how you make your money. But, this foundational piece here can mean more has to be done before sealing the deal. Okay? You have to resettle something that you thought had a steady foundation, or you have to go back to something financially. And so I have two examples here. So, for example, a house someone wanted to buy, put back on the market. Let's say you wanted to buy a house in February. It was this beautiful house, or you really wanted it, and just, somebody else put it, put in to buy the house. I forgot what it's called, y'all. It is, I forgot what it's called, and I bought a house before. I forgot what it's called. But basically, it's like when someone says they're interested in a house, right? I don't think it's a bid, but someone puts in an interest in the house, makes an offer, right? Makes an offer, I want to buy this house. As you know, buying a house can be a lengthy process, and it really depends on so many other variables. And so there can be times where it takes several months for some people. And because of that, you could have a person where like, oh, all of a sudden the house is coming back. Oh, the house is back on the market. Now, if Mars is in retrograde, it might still mean you have to pull a lot of strings. It doesn't mean you walking in, it's going to be easy. Because it's still a retrograde period, but there is opportunity could come up. And even if we're in a retrograde period, if your chart is set up for you to buy a home, if your chart, your placements and your aspects are showing that you are supposed to do this right now, it doesn't matter if it's a retrograde. People buy houses and make accomplishments all year long. It doesn't matter. Like a retrograde doesn't stop everyone from being successful. To understand how it affects you, you'd have to look at your individual chart and all those different components. And another example I wanted to give is like someone has an unexpected expense and goes back to a side gig temporarily, right? Like a person's like, they have a full-time job, but something comes up, the car gets damaged, they have to pay an extra bill, so they go do, they go drive Uber again, or they go do DoorDash again to make some extra money. And I know some people make good money doing those different things, and that's what they do all day. But some people have it more of like a weekend or nighttime thing. And so that's an example of that. Okay. So what can you do during any retrograde, or Mars and Gemini retrograde in particular? So what I say about energy, especially with retrogrades, and I know there's a lot people don't like about it, that they fear about it. I always say, meet the energy head on. if energy is there, it's going to happen anyway, but you have to learn how to work with it. Okay, Mars and Gemini is going to be about this. How do I also be about that? So that way I'm working with the energy. I'm using it to get it on my side. And again, that's a larger conversation about energy, but that is how you can use retrogrades, right? Yes, they can be tricky. Yes, they can be difficult, but at the end of the day, they can be used in ways that help facilitate a level of, going back, retracking, addressing something that could become even bigger if we don't allow that pause point. So here are some ideas. Don't lose sight of what you're trying to actually accomplish, okay? If Mars and Gemini, remember, Gemini is a trickster, okay? But if Mars and Gemini can be quite, kind of surprising, or you're uncertain of what really, it's like Mars and Gemini, think about it. It knows what it's trying to do, but not everybody understands that thought process. So like, don't lose sight of what you're trying to accomplish. If you get into an argument or a confrontation or there's some type of difficulty, even if it's not direct, what are you trying to actually get out of the situation? Because that's really what Mars is about. And with Mars and Gemini, it's already at a little bit of a, default. And then if it's in retrograde, even more so. Reflect on your course of action. Okay, you did something. Was it the best thing to do? Reflect. Think to yourself. Create some solutions. Okay? Also, confront the problem and be deliberate with your words. If you know there's a problem, it's no point in running from it. There's no point in waiting for it to dissipate, right? Be deliberate with your words, because the best thing you can do when you sense a problem before someone else is you get to plan. Think about Gemini and the words and the sophistication or the importance of words with Gemini energy and that communication. And so be deliberate in what you're trying to accomplish and get across. Take action first if you identify a potential problem, which kind of goes right back to the bullet point I just discussed, how important that is. Using that energy, using the information that you have for your advantage, to your advantage, use it all. Use all the information you have. Know ahead of time what you're trying to do. Ask people to explain the rationale behind their actions. You might be set because maybe you are not, negatively affected by this energy, or you know how to use energy. And if you're noticing people are acting out of character, or people aren't sticking to their word, or people aren't doing things the way that you have intended or that you have agreed upon, whatever the case is in your personal life, your relationships, work, family, whatever you going on. Ask people to explain the rationale behind their actions, because they might need you to pause them and say, "Whoa, wait, let's backtrack here." So don't be afraid to work with the energy that's around you. At any given time with the transit, it might not, maybe Mars is in Gemini squaring something in your chart, but you still can work with it. Okay. So that was it for this video. If you stuck around long enough or you watch any segment of this, thank you for watching.